Good morning. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday, Erev Shabbos. Let's light up the darkness. So great to be back and learning with you. I was away for a week and I miss learning with you. Who's in the house? Renee in Indiana, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Joe in the Inland Empire, Nancy in North Carolina, Shandora in the Bronx, Yehudit in South Carolina, Aoife in Florida, Ella in Southern California, Alan in New York City. Welcome, everybody. This is our winter schedule going at 11:30 a.m. Pacific, so that folks on the East Coast, where I guess it's 2:30 p.m., in the afternoon, and Shabbos approaching quickly, making it easier for you to get into Shabbos, and we'll be keeping the Friday classes on the short side. Our daf, today's page 167, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in chapter 10, and with God's help, we'll finish Mishnah 2 today and open Mishnah number 3. We're right at the top of page 167a. Abaye said, with regard to this one who needs to show his signature in court for the purpose of corroborating his signature on a document, he should not show it by writing it at the end of the parchment. In other words, he's being asked to give an example of his signature so that they can compare it to his signature on some legal document. So the paper, or the parchment that he writes his signature, his example of his signature on it's a blank piece of paper. And the concern is that some unscrupulous person will get a hold of this blank paper, this blank parchment with his signature on it, and then they'll write a contract on that paper and say that he signed it. So if you put your signature at the bottom of a blank paper, when all contracts were handwritten, you ran this danger. So they're advising you, put your name at the top of this parchment so it couldn't have a contract written over your signature. Right? He should not give an example of his signature by writing it at the end of the parchment, lest another unscrupulous person find the parchment and write above the signature that the signatory owes him money. And such a document would be valid. As we learned in a Mishna on page 175b of this tractate, if one presents to a debtor a document in the handwriting of the debtor stating that he owes money to the one who claims to be a creditor, but without witnesses signed on the document, the creditor can collect only from unsold property. He will not have this document will not create a lien on property that the borrower had and then sold to some purchaser, so the creditor won't be able to chase down that property. But what they're saying is that a promissory note, even in the absence of witnesses, may be used to collect property. Obviously, this guy's going to say, I never wrote such a note, and there's going to be an investigation and a litigation, but the lack of witness signatures is not going to be enough to make that document worthless, right? And so there is this danger that if you sign a blank paper, somebody could turn it into such a promissory note. The Gemara relates now an incident. We've done a lot of these principles of documents and signatures without incidents. So now let's talk about some actual things that happened. So the Gemara relates there was a certain Jewish tax collector who came before Abaye and said to him, "Let the master show me his signature on a piece of paper to keep in my records, as when rabbis come to me, and show me a note with your signature on it, attesting to the fact that they are Torah scholars, I let them pass without paying the tax. So Abaye showed him his signature at the top of the parchment, right? Following this principle of if you're giving an example of your signature, you do it at the top of a piece of paper, not at the bottom. But the unscrupulous, this guy is a fraudster, the unscrupulous tax collector kept pulling the parchment away from Abaye so that he would sign it towards the bottom. And Abaye noticed this. And he said to this unscrupulous tax collector, the sages have already anticipated people such as you and advised that one should never write his signature at the bottom of the paper. In other words, this advice is given not out of the sage's imagination, someday something like this crazy thing could happen, but in fact, there are unscrupulous people out there. And so sadly, I know it's true. We have run into unscrupulous people in our lives, and it's just awful. Abaye said, when writing a promissory note, one should not write any number from 3 until 10 at the end of the line, lest someone commit forgery and write an extension to the number, since it is at the end of the line. Now, what are they talking about? In Hebrew and Aramaic, the words for the numbers 3 through 10, like shalosh is 3 and shloshim is 30. So they can be changed, from a 3 to a 30, from a 9 to a 90, and all the numbers in between, by appending to them the suffix in, right, the sound in, which is yud and nun. That would be, I think, in Aramaic, and then in Hebrew would be yud mem, im. And 10 can be changed to 20 in a similar manner. And if by chance it occurs for him that these numbers fall out at the end of a line, he should repeat his words 2 or 3 times, stating and restating the agreement in question, as it is impossible that the number will not eventually occur for him in the middle of a line. When there is a contradiction, it is the final mention of the amount that is authoritative, as the Mishna teaches. And to help us understand this, the Gemara relates, there was an incident. There was a certain bill of sale in which it was written that the item sold was, in my garden, 1/3 of the orchard. And the purchaser went and erased the roof and the foot of the letter base or bait of the term of the orchard, right? So bifardesa, so the bet at the beginning of like pardes is an orchard, also can sometimes mean paradise. But an orchard is a pardes. So if you want to say of the orchard, you'd say bifardes, which is the same as bipardes, but the pay becomes a fe. So bifardes. And so in Hebrew, the suffix of is just adding a letter to the word that comes next. And so they wanted to write of the orchard, but they changed the bet to a vav. Now, when you put a vav in front of a word instead of a bet, you would change the meaning from of the orchard to and the orchard, right? And so if you look at this little illustration if you can see, that's a letter bet, but they erase the top and the bottom, right? The horizontal line at the bottom of the bet, and the horizontal line at the top, and then the vertical stem that's left now resembles a vav. And so, because you would just change one letter, but in Hebrew, the one letter can stand for another word if it's a prefix. And so they were changing from saying that I'm going to sell you something that's of the orchard to saying I'm selling you this and the orchard, right? Big difference in a contract for purchase and sale. So the purchaser went and erased the roof and foot of the letter base of the term of the orchard, bifardesa, and thereby changed the prefix base into a vav, thereby yielding in the purchase agreement that it would say, in my garden, 1/3, and the orchard, right? Instead of bifardesa, now becomes ufardesa. The vav can be vowelized as an u when it is followed by certain letters in a sentence. And so now it becomes, instead of, of the orchard, it becomes and the orchard. So the document came before Abaye, who said to the purchaser, what is the reason that there is so much space around this vav? Since the letter vav is narrower than the letter base, a larger space between letters emerged as compared to the spacing of letters in the rest of the document. Abaye bound the purchaser. Now what that means is he subjected him to physical coercion, and he admitted that he had forged the document. Okay, so in other words, Abaye became suspicious because a scribe had written this document, and there was regular spacing to the letters, and now there was an irregular space, and he thought, oh, maybe this base was changed to a vav. He was suspicious. He questioned this guy. The guy lied and said, no, of course not. But under pressure, he admitted that he had done it. Now, the Gemara relates there was a certain bill of sale in which it was written that the item being sold was the portions of Reuven and Shimon, brothers. Right? The portion of Reuven and Shimon, comma, brothers. Brothers is ache. So Reuven and Shimon happened to have a brother whose name was Achai, which, when writing without vowels, is spelled identically to ache. Right? So the name Achai looks just like the word ache, which means brothers. So the purchaser went and wrote a conjunctive vav in the document before the word ache and changed the wording into the portions of Reuven, Shimon, and Achai. Right? So in other words, if imagine three brothers each had a field, what was being sold was the fields of Reuven and Shimon. Now this purchaser changed the document so that it would now he would have purchased the fields of Reuven, Shimon, and Achai, whereas what the contract had said, the portions of Reuven and Shimon, who are brothers. The purchaser went, so the document came before Abaye. I'm sure the brothers are claiming we didn't sell the portion of our third brother. So the document came before Abaye, who said to the purchaser, what is the reason that it is so crowded around this vav? By inserting the extra vav, a smaller space between letters emerged as compared to the spacing of the letters in the rest of the document. Abaye bound the purchaser, i.e. he subjected him to physical coercion, and he admitted that he had forged the document. The Gemara relates, there was a certain document upon which the signatures of Rava and Rav Acha bar Ada were signed. And the one holding the document came before Rava, right? One of the guys who allegedly has signed this document. And Rava said to him, well, this is my signature, but I never signed any document before Rav Acha bar Ada. And Rava bound the holder of the document, i.e. subjected him to physical coercion, and he admitted the forgery. And Rava said to him, well, granted, you were able to forge my signature, but how did you perform a forgery of Rav Acha bar Ada's signature, since his hands shake, and as a result, his signature is distinctive? And the man said, I placed my hands on the rope of a narrow footbridge and was thereby able to replicate Rav Acha's signature. The forger was proud of his work. And some say that the forgery was accomplished when the forger stood upon a wobbly water skin and wrote the signature. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 10. Now, Mishnah number 3. A scribe may write a bill of divorce for a man, a gett. A scribe may write a gett for a man who requests one, even if his wife is not with him, to give her consent when he presents his request, as there is no possibility that he will misuse the document. In other words, a woman does not become divorced until the husband hands her the gett. So he can have the gett written up so that it'll be ready for him to present to her, but there's no chance of misuse. by the same token, a scribe would not write up a gett for a wife who was requesting it, because she could claim that her husband divorced her when he had not. But if the husband requests one, the scribe can write it up. And a scribe may write a receipt for a woman upon her request, attesting to the payment of her marriage contract, even if her husband is not with her to give his consent. Right? Whereas a scribe will not write a receipt for the payment of a ketubah, the payment of a marriage contract, if the husband requests it, right? Because then he could claim, hey, I paid you your ketubah and here's my receipt. So the scribe will not write it for him. He would only write it for her so that she's ready. When she receives her payment, she'll have the receipt ready to give. This is true, provided that the scribe recognizes the parties requesting the document to prevent misrepresentation. And for both documents, the husband gives the scribe his wages. The husband pays. Now we're on page 167b. A scribe may write a promissory note for a debtor who requests one, even if the creditor is not with him when he requests the document. But a scribe may not write a promissory note for a creditor who requests it unless the debtor is with him and consents. And it is the debtor who pays the scribe. Again, you can hand a promissory note for a loan that hasn't been extended yet, to the borrower, right? So that he has the document ready when it's time for him to borrow the money. When the rich man's not in town yet, but the scribe's only here this week. So the potential borrower says, well, write me a promissory note so that when you're gone next week and the rich man comes to town, I will be able to borrow money and hand him the promissory note. But the scribe would not write a promissory note for a potential lender, because then he could claim he had lent the money even when he had not. A scribe may write a bill of sale for a seller of a field who requests one, even if the purchaser is not with him when he presents his request. But a scribe may not write a bill of sale for a purchaser who requests it unless the seller is with him and consents. And it is the purchaser who gives the scribe his wages. A scribe may not write documents of betrothal and documents of marriage except with the consent of both parties, the groom and the bride. And it is the groom who gives the scribe his wages. A scribe may not write contracts for sharecroppers and contractors except with the consent of both parties, the groom with the consent of both parties, i.e. the sharecropper or contractor and the one who hires him. And it is the sharecropper or contractor who gives the scribe his wages. And finally, a scribe may not write documents testifying to arbitration agreements or any other court enactment except with the consent of both parties to the litigation. And both parties give the scribe his wages. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says the scribe writes two documents for the two parties, one for this one by himself and one for that one by himself. And that concludes the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. What is meant by provided that the scribe recognizes the parties requesting the document? Rav Yehuda says that Rav says it means provided that he recognizes the man's name in the case of the gett and the woman's name in the case of the receipt for payment of a ketubah. The Gemara relates Rav Safra and Rav Acha bar Huna and Rav Huna bar Chinana were sitting, and Abaye was sitting near them. And as they were sitting, they raised a dilemma. Did Rav mean that with regard to the man's name in the case of a bill of divorce, yes, it must be known to the scribe, but the woman's name need not be known to the scribe? And did he mean that with regard to the woman's name in the case of the receipt for payment of the ketubah, yes, it must be known to the scribe, but the man's name need not be known to the scribe? But if so, let there be a concern that perhaps the man who made the request writes the gett and intends to go and give it to the wife of another man with the same name, right? In other words, this woman will be able to procure a gett for herself and get herself divorced, fraudulently, by having a man who has the same name, and presumably it's like, basically I think they would need to have two couples that have the same names. And this woman's trying to get a divorce from her husband. He won't give her a gett. So she goes to this other couple, the man of that couple, and says, have a gett written with the names of you and your wife, who happen to be the same names as me and my husband, and then hand me that gett, and then I will be able to claim I'm divorced. She won't be, but they will create doubt, it'll create problems with her husband, and we have, the court is sensitive that this could create enormous confusion. And similarly, in the case of the receipt for the marriage payment, the payment of marriage contract, the ketubah, let there be a concern that there will be times when the woman writes the receipt and intends to give it to a man who is not her husband, whose wife shares her name. So Abaye said to them, you are not understanding Rav's statement correctly. This is what Rav says. The man's name in the case of the bill of divorce must be known to the scribe, and the same is true of the woman's name, which must also be known to the scribe. And the woman's name in the case of the receipt must be known to the scribe, and the same is true of the man's name, which must also be known to the scribe. So they continue their line of reasoning. Okay, well, even if both names are known to the scribe, let there be a concern for the possibility of two men with the same name, such as two men named Yosef ben Shimon, who live in one city, and whose wives share the same name as well. And perhaps the man who made the request will write the gett and intend to go and give it to the wife of the other man who bears the same name as him, as I said before. And Rav Acha bar Huna said to them in reply that this is what Rav says. If there are two men named Yosef ben Shimon who live in one city, and they are both married to women who have the same name, then they may divorce their wives only in the presence of one another, so that there will not be any confusion in that city of who got divorced from who. Okay, so they continue to ask, but even if the scribe knows the man's name and the name of the man's wife, let there be a concern that perhaps someone will go to another city and establish a false name for himself as Yosef ben Shimon, and he will write the bill of divorce and give it to the wife of the other man whose name really is Yosef ben Shimon. Rav Huna bar Chanana said to them that this is what Rav says with regard to anyone whose name has been established in a city for 30 days. There is no concern harbored about him that his name is false. It is assumed that this is his true name. Okay, so they continue to ask, well, what if his name has not been established for 30 days? How can a newcomer in a town have a gett, a bill of divorce, drawn up for him? And Abaye said, it is sufficient that people call him by his name. It is sufficient that people call him by the name that he claims for himself, and he responds to that call. Well, Rav Zevid said, a liar is careful about upholding his lies. And just because he responds to being called by a particular name does not prove he is telling the truth. A newcomer would therefore have to wait 30 days before requesting that a scribe write him a gett. There was a certain... Excuse me. There was... Oh boy. Why I keep my handy pitcher of water here. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol nihir b'ro. Okay. There was a certain receipt of payment of a marriage contract, a ketubah, and some say kesubah. More in my neighborhood, we would say kesubah. Okay, there was a certain receipt of payment of a kesubah upon which Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba was signed as a witness. That woman, whose name matched the name on the receipt, came before Rav Yirmiyah seeking to collect payment of her kesubah. So Rav Yirmiyah recognized her name, but not her appearance. And the woman said to him, it was not I whose name was on the receipt that you signed, but another woman with the same name. I have not collected payment of my kesubah. Rav Yirmiyah said, I too said to the other witnesses signed on the document, the woman for whom we signed the receipt is not she. But they said to me, it is in fact the same woman, but she has aged and her voice has matured and changed, and that is why you do not recognize her. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in now. Abaye said that although the sages said, once one has stated his testimony, he may not then state a revision, this case of Rav Yirmiyah is an exception, and he can retract his initial statement in which he supported the woman's claim that she had not been paid, rather that some other woman with the same name had been paid. And he had supported her because it didn't look to him like the same woman. And the reason that we allow him to change his testimony this is very interesting, that it is not the manner of a Torah scholar to be careful about identifying women for reasons of modesty, right? And what they're saying is that a Torah scholar doesn't go around staring at women. In fact, you will find, among very pious Jews, that they will avert their eyes from women. And it's not that they're, somehow sexist and don't want to look at women because they think there's something wrong with women. It's that they're being careful to shield their eyes from gazing at a woman, because they're into her. They don't want to, give into feelings of attraction. They don't even want that possibility to come up. And so, they save that for their wives. It's very similar. My friend Schwartzy of blessed memory, Hasidic men, Orthodox men, many of them are what's called shomer negia. They guard the body. And they don't touch any woman who's not their wife. And that can be a little awkward just, outside of the frum world, the Orthodox, observant world, where, business people shake hands all the time. Men and women shake hands all the time. But for these guys, they don't shake hands with a woman. And so Schwartzy used to say, I'm sorry I can't shake hands with you. The last time I shook hands with a woman, I had 9 kids with her. But there's this idea that they don't go around staring at women. And so what they're talking about here is, and therefore, they're not ideal witnesses for identifying, whether a woman signed the document or not. And the Gemara relates there was a certain receipt of payment for a marriage contract upon which Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba was signed. No, I just said that? No, I said that? No, it's another story. This is another story. Yeah, there was a certain receipt of payment for a kesub upon which Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba was signed. A woman whose name appeared on the receipt. It's kind of the same story, but it's not the same story. A woman whose name appeared on the receipt, who was seeking to collect payment of her kesuba, said to him, it was not I, but another woman with the same name, who had this receipt written. And he said to her, but it was you, and you are lying now. And Abaye said, although I said that it is not the manner of a Torah scholar to be careful about identifying women, once he is careful about such an identification, and he states positively that he recognizes a particular woman, well, then he is careful, and he's saying, well, I don't go around looking at women, but I had reason to have a conversation with her. I know exactly what she looks like, and that is her, and then we believe him. And Abaye said, a Torah scholar who goes to betroth a woman should take an am haaretz, an ignoramus, with him to establish a positive identity of the woman, lest people exchange another woman for her when given to him for marriage, taking advantage of his innocence. The fact that he doesn't stare at women until, he's married to her, somebody could take advantage of that. So he should take somebody who's not so careful about averting his gaze to sort of be his assistant when he gets betrothed. That's what I've got for us today. Let me see if I've got some comments or questions. Looks like there's at least one while my Google Doc is reloading. Joe, some of the rabbis used an icon of sorts indicating their signature. Right, we talked about that recently. Examples, a ship mast, a fish, and a palm. Do you think that it was to keep their signature out of the public domain in an effort to cut down forgeries? I hadn't thought of that before, but that may well be. That's so interesting. Right, because when they were publishing edicts, which were widely disseminated, so their mark, went out and people understood it was who it was from. But when they needed to sign, personal matters of purchase and sale, etc., where they're going to be financially responsible, maybe they saved their signature for that. I don't know. It's a very interesting conjecture. I wonder if that's true. That's what I've got for us this evening. I hope that everyone will have, may God grant us all an uplifting, energizing Shabbos. Definitely, Vayishlach, this week's Torah portion is, every Torah portion is fascinating, but this one is just beyond. This is Jacob's reunion with his brother Esau, the absolutely perplexing episode of Jacob's daughter Dinah and the prince of Shechem, known as Shechem, which, when I was completely separated from, I just distant from Judaism as a young man, but I took a class as an English major in college about the Bible as literature, and we read the whole Bible. And I came to that story, and I was like, whoa, they never taught us this in Hebrew school. I'm trying to understand. It's so hard to understand that story. It certainly doesn't make the Jews look good. And I think, at least at some level, that was the point. The Torah as the origin tale of the Jewish people, it's not some kind of hagiography. It's not to make us look good. It's to, really get at the truth and the hard situations that people encounter. And sometimes our ancestors, lived up to the challenge and behaved so incredibly honorably and righteously. And sometimes they failed and had to make a teshuvah and an atonement. And sometimes it's not so clear what the right and wrong is from the simple reading of the text. And the commentary really helps us understand it at a much deeper level. But there's just a bunch of sort of sub-stories within this week's Torah portion that is a great one to read and study. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, see you tomorrow night after Shabbos ends in LA. Now we're in the winter. These are the earliest ending Shabboses. So it should be on the air by 7 p.m.-ish, maybe even a little earlier. That's what I've got for us. All the best.